Today, I really want to look at international migration in the Asian context. Last week, or the end of last week, we looked at Australia migration programs, etc. I want to just pick up Asia at the moment and show you some quite interesting things going on in the region. We talked about traditional approaches. Well, I'm going to bring up new approaches which are applying also in Asia to a lesser extent. Then I want to go through 4 types of migration, because clearly Asian migration is, you can't generalise, it's very, very different within the region now, and clearly there's different types. I've got 2 readings there, one that we'll be using in the tutorial, but the latter one, or both of those, are actually important as background to the lecture. So if we're looking at a new perspective on migration in the Asian context, it's the potential for migrants to help transform their native countries has captured the imaginations of national and local authorities, international institutions and the private sector. In other words, the benefits of migration now are seen within many countries. There's an emerging consensus that countries can cooperate to create triple wins for the migrants, for their countries of origin and all those societies that receive them. So that triple win situation is the new transnationalism in terms of everybody can win if there's emphasis put on that, and that's the United Nations saying that back in 2006. The constraints in studying Asia-Pacific migration, data limitations, which clearly hampers some of the very accurate things we can say anyway. The complexity of the region, as I said, very different contexts, different levels of development, different demographics of the populations, the diversity of the countries themselves, just in terms of their economies and their policies and what they really expect out of migration. The drivers of an increase in Asian migration basically has been related to the demographics. That's the widening of the demographic gradients between more developed countries and less developed countries, with youth populations growing substantially in the later and declining in more developed countries. So we call it the demographic divide, whereby we have a lot of youth now being educated in these populations and are fueling, if you like, a lot of the migration to the more developed countries. And let's say developing countries are quite willing to get rid of a lot of them because they can't supply jobs for everybody, and they see the benefits of moving them elsewhere, but they do like to think they'll come back to those countries with new skills, new networks, new connections, etc. There's also a widening in economic gradients between wages within the Asian region. So there's differences in the Asian region itself. So you're getting a lot of, that's where you're getting south-south migration. They're moving across the region from those lesser developed ones into the more developed ones that are actually needing and wanting labour. The globalisation of labour markets and internationalisation of other economic activities also causing quite big diversity and complexity within Asia, generating migration. As we've talked before, the cheapening of international transport, just in airfares and ability for people to move. Increased levels of formal education amongst both men and women. Proliferation of mass media in terms of support and diffusion of ideas and where they can go to get extra work, etc. That migration industry is important in facilitating a lot of the movement, particularly of contract workers in the region. The spread of these international social networks, clearly important because those social networks of friends, family, not only provide the knowledge of where to go, but clearly help in facilitating settlement in those areas or getting them jobs, giving them housing, etc. And labour market segmentation in destinations basically ensures a continuation of demand for migrant workers. Segmentation of the labour market can be different female and male labour markets called sex-segregated markets, and different sorts of business and construction industry or caring industries or whatever, which will attract either men or females, males or females, or electronic industries like females, for example. So permanent resettlement versus transnationalism has been also strong. Formerly, most international migrants moved permanently, and while they maintained linkages with the homeland, they were infrequent. We've moved to this new type of migration. They move more frequently between countries with cheaper and quicker transport, and developments in communication technology make it possible to maintain frequent and intimate contact. So there's, let's say, these linkages that are being supported and allows much more freedom of movement to and fro. Major trends in Asia Pacific, like other trends, have increased in scale or size. They've increased in complexity. They've increased the involvement of women, increased in the involvement of governments, because governments can see some of the benefits of their workers and population moving out of the country and either supplying remittances or supplying work experience and ideas when they come back. There's been growth in undocumented migration. Again, that's been made easier through these migration agents and other people with knowledge, and we call them traffickers, but often they're through the industry just paying people to get them to certain countries or jobs. And in terms of Asia in particular, there's been increasing contractual labour mobility, and in some countries, particularly women, have been most involved in that contract work to go elsewhere, work and then come back. Later we'll talk about transnational mothering, whereby they go away to work because the segregated labour market wants them, so they go and support the household from earning money abroad. This is by origin of Asian countries, 1990s through to 2013. So clearly Central Asia has been, the net migration's negative, and all these countries have basically been losing migrants to Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, some more than others, but clearly there's been an out-migration generally from origins of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia and Southern Asia and Eastern Asia. Destination by destination Asia, again, where do they go? If you like, average growth rates are highest in Southeast Asia and have been for that period. Southern Asia tends to be losing overall, and Eastern Asia seems to be growing. The new migration is quite selective. We often say those with get up and go are likely the ones to be most attracted to pursuing going elsewhere, and that's true of all groups of migrants basically. And women now move in similar numbers to men. And basically the next one, the poorest of the poor do not move. We could say the ones most in need or desperate of their economic circumstances generally aren't the ones that can or do move. And that often relates to all of the family, or there might be one family member moves and actually has the skills or whatever and can send the money back home. But generally, even those poorest families miss out on those migrants moving abroad because they don't have enough education or they don't have enough nous or social workers to get out of, or social networks to get themselves out of the country. High educational selectivity. Primary school is a basis for a lot of education now, but some secondary schooling, particularly for women, has been important. And it basically, they're amongst the groups who will get up and go and can get work outside of those countries. Selectivity reduces with maturity of the migration stream. So over time, we find some of this selectivity reduces. Remember, it sets up social networks. It makes it easier for some families to send people abroad. Unfortunately, it's the better off families that actually benefit from any forms of migration. Drivers of the new migration, just remember the 3 Ds: development, demography and democracy. Okay, levels of development. Demography I was just talking about, those countries with really large youth populations are the ones most likely to be supplying migrants elsewhere. The ones with falling youth populations and an ageing workforce and ageing carrying on quite considerably are also recipient countries like the more developed countries. And democracy makes a difference as well in terms of freedom to move, and they're likely to go to countries that are more democratic than autocratic or highly controlled. Policies on highly skilled migration between 2000 and 2013. Sorry, a bit of funny throat. Back in 2005, 67 countries said they just wanted to maintain, 67%, sorry, 26 countries wanted to maintain their skilled migration. That basically had dropped, and most wanted to raise their skilled migration policies by 2013. Lower and no intervention basically remained the same. So the shift is where a lot of the Asian countries have seen the benefits of attracting highly skilled migration into them and clearly have changed. The Asian migration model in the late 1990s, this is going back a decade or so, were very much about the policies were to restrict migration, highly restrictive, and it was generally not perceived as being a positive thing for the nation state. So it's been a relatively short turnaround in the last decade or so where they've seen it being advantageous to actually loosen or make their immigration policies more flexible. Settlement was not allowed even in nations with good reasons for migration, such as the demand for labour and the arrival of asylum seekers fleeing persecution. They weren't keen about receiving anyone that was foreign into those countries. Emphasis was on constraint, policing and exclusion rather than migration management. Little tradition in the development of a managed migration system, unlike Australia. Remember, has a very managed migration program and policies. These were really all about keeping migrants or foreigners per se out. Where the need for migrant workers, tourists, business people was recognised, essential to the economy, it was basically temporary basis, not given permanent status. Foreigners generally could not become citizens except in exceptional circumstances. How does that differ with Australia?
Focused on permanent residence.
applying for, say, permanent residence, even if they're temporary, and they can obtain citizen status, given conditions and after a period of time. So that's very different than a lot of the Asian countries didn't contemplate citizenship being available at any point in time to these so-called foreigners. Changes in the last 10 years or so, increasing recognition that migration is a structural feature of the modern global economy, so they're recognising advantages to actually being part of the global economy. And more countries in the Asian context are being more explicit with some migration policies. And that's towards people who left there, or expats, if you like, as well as their overseas permanent settlers, like their populations overseas, diasporas, and also people going into those countries have more rights than they used to. Singapore has a sophisticated and flexible policy. They can see benefits of freeing up some of the conditions to attract permanent people to come there rather than a lot of undocumented migrants. So is Malaysia and Thailand. Marriage migration, we'll talk about a bit later, is also very important for Japan, Korea and Taiwan. And for that to be successful, obviously they have to offer citizenship or permanency to those women who are migrating to some of those countries. There's basically 4 types, which I want to systematically bore you with and go through them. The first is developed economies. Several Asian countries have long completed the demographic transition. Demographic transition means they've gone right through the transition and are at a relatively stable or low rate of population growth. And together their economies developed, and obviously they've experienced growth through limiting some of the population. That has led to labour shortages, which has meant they have programs to attract both unskilled and skilled migrants. So in those countries undergoing the demographic transition, they brought down rapid population growth generally, and their populations are starting to age. So they have an ageing population, they have a shrinking workforce often, or they're going to have. So they're looking at both skilled and unskilled, which is different to Australia, but they're really concerned. They don't have enough unskilled people to do a lot of the jobs their citizens don't want to do. Developing economies. In several Asian countries, the completion of the demographic transition has come later. And while they experience rapid economic growth, they remain low to middle income countries or nations because they have still a very burgeoning young population they've got to support. When the demographic transition comes late, do you know what that means? It means fertility has stayed high, they bring mortality down, people are living longer. Demographic transition to much lower fertility hasn't been as rapid, and that's the period of really rapid population expansion. And that's where often their economies can't cope with that, because that's where some of those countries are only too willing for some of their population to migrate elsewhere for economic benefits to them as well as the country themselves. The Gulf countries generally, oil-rich countries in the Middle East, were a special case following the 73 oil crisis. Massive inflow of wealth to those regions found basis for major infrastructure, services development, and the workforce could not be met by such small populations. And I think I showed you in the first lecture or second just how great some of the foreign-born populations of these countries are, 70% or more, because what has been imported to them is a labour force generally. Often construction workers and others who have stayed, but generally they still import low-skilled or unskilled, semi-skilled workers to boost or fuel those economies where they're locals, again local populations of a small population, are just not there for such tasks. Return migration is a component that's becoming really important, and it's like high-skilled emigration out of the region has been significant. It's been matched with significant return flows of those skilled people, especially to some of the first lot of those economies. They offer jobs and wages similar to what they can get in a Euro-American destination context. So it becomes popular for them to return to their home countries to get jobs, to families and whatever, or they just really want to, attracted to going home. Those developed economies completed that demographic transition to such an extent that their workforce was ageing rapidly, and given their ageing populations, they needed, obviously, to start importing to counteract that ageing. They have high per capita incomes, for example, relatively very much higher than elsewhere where they might have even been living. The economy is increasingly based on knowledge-intensive industries and manufacturing and services and high-end technology and innovation. So they are screaming out for some of their skilled workers to return to their home countries to bring the knowledge with them, but also participate in that workforce. High-income countries of Asia we go through China, Hong Kong, China, Macau, Japan, Republic of Korea, South Korea, Brunei, Singapore, Thailand. Obviously, they've had high growth, high per capita incomes, and growth rate of population of working age is 15 to 64 years. Can be, in the case of Japan and Korea, shrinking. So therefore, they're worried about importing these workers into those economies. Singapore, most sophisticated migration policy. This is from Yeo and Lam. In the last 15 years, in particular, bid to develop the city-state into a global hub for knowledge-intensive industries in manufacturing and services, with the emphasis on high-end technology. Innovation has underpinned the push to augment the local talent pool by attracting foreign talent who can help Singapore move up the value chain in key industries such as electronics, chemicals, engineering, life science, education, healthcare, headquarters, communication, media and logistics. Now that includes sending students overseas for education to go back with some of these skills and knowledge as well. So these higher income countries are keen to develop those higher end industries. This is Singapore citizens. This is non-residents and permanent residents. So up to 1990, permanent residents, very low indeed. We have now more permanent residents as migrants, and we also have non-migrants, non-residents as migrants or temporary ones, also increasing. So since the 90s, you've seen a rise in both of those groups. Those non-residents have foreign talents of skilled professional and managerial skills. There's also foreign workers of low skills needed. Mid-level skills, also technicians, healthcare workers, and also international students and others. So those are all groups that have been trying to attract to Singapore to boost that economy. Japan always had anti-migration was an anti-migration nation. But there was a long-standing policy to admit talented foreigners. Key barriers, languages and institutions, but however local and regional government more favourably disposed towards migration than the central government overall. But there also has been a loosening of some of that migration policy to allow foreigners in. Foreigners, however, couldn't become citizens. This is just showing the green line is non-permanent residents or migrants coming in, and this is permanent residents. So clearly there's a trend there to allow more temporary visas or people coming in amongst the foreigners in the 80s, 90s. Major characteristics of these programs have been to attract highly skilled workers, non-acceptance of unskilled workers, but there is significant undocumented migration of those workers. So they might say we're not really encouraging unskilled, but the undocumented migrants are basically will be unskilled workers that have been getting in for jobs or contracts. There's a program of training migration of people employed by Japanese companies overseas, especially in Southeast Asia. So they send their workers or managerial staff overseas into these positions, and in effect they also take people, if they're selling cars for example, or Toyota will have people recruited in Japan as well. They've also allowed Japanese descendants, largely from South America, to attract them back to the country, and special temporary programs for entertainer, carers and students. Again, the temporary visas, student visas, carer visas, this is areas where they know they've got some demand. Substantial international marriage migrations, predominantly of women. And again, that's where they've had to relax some migration policies to allow them to come and stay within the country or marry and settle in the country. Some of them are a bit nasty there in Malaysia and Singapore as well. At first they might not be allowed to work or do a lot of things for a period of time until they can get this citizenship. I think we think, well, that's really rough, or that's really nasty, we wouldn't like to do that, but you know, it can be up to 2 to 4 years, some of them. Strict border enforcement as an island country. So Japan is quite, if you say, restrictive, particularly in its migration policy now. It was complete restriction, but at least it's relaxed somewhat because of demand and some of the necessity to do so. South Korea is similar to Japan in economic development, but it's also in the role of marriage migration. Now has a migration policy, but in that case most migrants are unskilled. When I was in Busan, it was interesting, they really were treating them very much like second-class citizens. They had restrictions on them, and they had quite firm controls over what they were doing, and health policy as well. Trends in high school foreign manpower, it's generally been increasing, late 90s to 2012. It also in that period had the first basic plan for immigration policy, securing growth by attracting highly skilled foreigners they actually wanted, and very restrictive, a bit like us. Attracting manpower overseas for balanced development of the national economy, and that again was largely unskilled from low-income countries in Asia, mainly for construction and other industries. Again, the more developed economy, workers were in short supply. And they try to create a foreign-friendly living environment. In other words, more welcoming of foreigners than they had been ever in the past. That's just an indication, if you like, of migrant workers, undocumented, say 687,000 odd, undocumented 169,000, so a fair proportion. Short-term employed about 14, that was short-term contracts generally, and spouses and students, 564, obviously matched with these migrant workers who are allowed to bring spouses. Remember, some countries are really very hard on that family reunion type categories. Non-professionals and professionals, non-professionals are also in supply or in demand and being supplied through their foreign workers. Taiwan, similar low level of skilled intake but large unskilled for Taiwan. In other words, that's the workers they actually need. Estimated shortage of workers in 2012, 175,000 or 14% skilled. So obviously there's these shortages in the workforces of these countries that have relatively low fertility and have aged really rapidly, aging rapidly. Skilled migration to developing economies, massive growth of investment by multinational operations in the region, which has seen that corporations transfer large numbers of MDC, more developed origin staff, into Asia. Hence, by 2003, there were 911 odd thousand Japanese citizens officially living overseas, many in other overseas countries, and this is some of their company executives, etc. They move to factories and etc. in other countries, or the less developed or developing economies. The mismatches between education and training systems and labour market skill needs in rapidly growing economies like Indonesia, whereby notwithstanding high levels of underemployment and educated unemployment, substantial numbers of expatriate engineers, technicians, accountants, finance and management experts, etc. have had to be imported. So they import a lot of those jobs, and you would think with their economies and their education levels, they end up with still a lot of educated unemployed, but the skills of foreigners seem to be more important than the ones that have been trained locally. And to some extent, I've got down there as a result of brain drain, they lose their best and brightest as well that they have trained. So there's this mismatch, and you see this movement backwards and forwards. I guess you could argue Australia loses a lot of its best engineers and doctors and whatever, so what is it doing? It tends to be importing skilled migrants from somewhere else. So up we go, as we got the chain, I guess it changes. So the drivers of migration, in just two bites of the cherry, there's generally mismatch between skills needed in labour market and output from the training institutions locally. However, governments often acting to reduce skilled immigration, like Indonesia, in other words, trying to give more jobs to their locally produced graduates. And gradually over time that will change, obviously. What they're really welcoming back now is some of those trained and experienced from overseas back into their local economies. That's just Indonesia and types of Indonesians employed, mainly in industry, manufacturing and trade. So foreign skilled are very much in demand in those areas. Also construction. The Middle East is a major global destination, 14% of immigrants, origins in small numbers of native population and low levels of education traditionally. And as I said, that changed with the boom in the 1970s, balance of skilled and low skilled workers, shift in origin away from Arab countries to Asia, and skill dominated by OECD. origins, but Asia increasing. In other words, Asia again is becoming much more important for the flows backwards and forwards to the Middle East. In the Middle East in particular, clear demarcation between nationals and non-nationals or foreigners. A highly flexible migration policy, however, letting them in to be workers, highly inflexible for naturalisation or citizenship policy. In other words, they don't mind contract workers. You can go and stay for quite long periods of time, but they don't want to actually give you citizenship. There's also a sponsorship system actually going on as well. Barriers to local application to enter labour market. In the skill-based job market, local workers still lack the technical skills to perform to standard in many of these positions, despite massive increases in education participation. So they're not quite up to standard, they're basically saying. There are mismatches in needs of the labour market and what courses are being taken in universities and other training. They also don't have appropriate people in those universities and training institutions to actually give them a skills or training to the levels that are required, which is another problem. And Australia, for example, a lot of aid programs, particularly in outer islands of Indonesia, have been providing assistance in education and books and resources in that context. In the low school area, a combination of official policies and lax enforcement allows private sector's employees much leeway in determining salaries and working conditions. In other words, poor salaries, poor working conditions. There's no such thing as unions or labour rules or workplace security or whatever. Accompanied by a high supply of low-skilled labour from developing countries, these factors suppress wages and bring labour conditions to the verge of and occasionally beyond exploitation. Cultural barriers are also important. People are desperate to get jobs and they'll accept whatever conditions are available. New return policies, these are what's really been quite significant in this new transnationalism. Circulation or temporary movement between the destination country and the homeland can be now associated with dual citizenship and holding positions in both countries. Australians can hold dual citizenships with signatory countries, which makes it much easier to go to and from a country. You don't have to actually take up permanent citizenship, you can keep both. A study of China-born academics showed that all maintained strong relationships with university in China through joint positions and frequent visiting spells in China. So they came backwards and forward and their jobs were available to them as well. Temporary return is then an important part of a comprehensive diaspora policy and is increasingly facilitated by faster and cheaper air travelling. However, it is increasingly being realised that massive developments in electronic communication is making virtual returns. So in other words, Skype and all sorts of other means and ways that we can stay in touch. So there's a new possibility for nationals to work and engage in other ways in their homeland without returning physically. Okay, in conclusion, last decade has seen a massive increase in Asia's share of the global economy. Okay, so Asia has become more and more important within the global economy and is sharing in some of those massive circulations of not just labour but trade and also trade agreements and money. Increased share of global immigrants. So in other words, immigrants are more likely now to be going to Asian countries from Australia, from America, and we'll talk about that Thursday in terms of Asia-Australian connections and the toing and froing of people. A major increase in skilled migration, so this is the skilled labour migration that tends to be the better educated. They're more keen to circulate, and they often just like getting experience in different countries, networking and coming back, building up business connections and government connections. A shift occurring in those Asian countries towards seeing migration as an integral part of the modern global economy. So they've come around to seeing as advantageous to them to actually loosen up on some of their migration really restrictive policies. They haven't quite loosened up yet to exposing a lot of foreigners to citizenship. There's a general loosening of a lot of the rules and regulations that used to be on skilled, particularly skilled, but also unskilled workers. There's remaining major challenges, governance, public opportunities, corruption is often cited as a major obstacle to doing business in a lot of these countries if you don't really know how it operates. Rent taking, meaning they're making money out of areas that they perhaps shouldn't be. Lack of adjustment and integration strategies. So in other words, they're often seen as sitting outside the mainstream and not being given the same rights and same opportunities within some of those countries. Okay. Now we must understand diversity and policy differences relating to levels of development, and I've been talking about economic differences, but clearly there's cultural differences. And that's really important for people who are trying to do business or going to work in these countries. They do understand what some of those cultural differences actually are. Okay.